look at the high-tech, headline-grabbing airframes of China's modern Air Force, like the Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, it is easy to assume this power was inevitable. But this is a distortion. It obscures a far more interesting story. A 50-year industrial long march, a brutal, agonizing climb from total technological irrelevance to world-class capability. To understand how the People's Liberation Army Air Force, an organization founded in 1949 as little more than a peasant army's aviation-themed appendage, achieved this transformation, one must ignore the J-20 and look at its ancestors. The entire story of China's aerospace industry, its failures, its crippling dependencies, and its few desperate triumphs, is written in the airframes of four specific aircraft: the Shenyang J-5, the Shenyang J-6, the Chengdu J-7, and the Shenyang J-8. This is not a story of sudden innovation. It is a story of imitation, desperation, failure, and finally, a bitter-won independence. The genesis of Chinese air power is not an invention, but a transaction. The Air Force's aviation industry was born on February 14, 1950, with the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This was not a partnership of equals. It was a Faustian bargain. Mao Zedong, having declared his nation would lean to one side, secured his new regime. Joseph Stalin, in return, secured his new communist flank and a massive, dependent buffer state. The price of this friendship was, in part, a $300 million Soviet credit, and more critically, the technical assistance for the 156 key projects of China's first five-year plan. Among these was the establishment of a domestic aviation industry from scratch. Soviet specialists flooded in, and funds, measured in millet to cope with hyperinflation, were allocated to build the Shenyang Aircraft Factory, Plant No. 112. This single treaty simultaneously created and crippled China's aviation industry for the next half-century. It provided the tools to build, but it established a foundational, systemic dependency. The early Air Force, flying Soviet-supplied aircraft, was simply a remote branch of the Soviet Air Force. Its first lesson was not how to design, but how to receive, how to copy, and how to build what someone else had designed. This dependency would be the central, agonizing conflict of the next 50 years, a vulnerability that would be exposed, time and again, by the J-5, J-6, J-7, and J-8. The first test of this new industrial base was not a design, it was an assignment. In 1955, as part of the 1950 treaty's provisions, China received the plans, 2 completed pattern aircraft, 15 knockdown kits, and parts for 10 more of the Soviet Union's premier transonic fighter, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-17F, codenamed Fresco C. China designated this aircraft the Chengdu J-5, or J-5. For Shenyang's new factory, this was the apprentice's test. The aircraft itself was a product of early jet-age pragmatism. Its construction was a conventional, all-metal, semi-monocoque fuselage designed to be simple, rugged, and mass-produced by a relatively low-skill workforce. A perfect fit for China's nascent industrial capacity. Its defining feature was its wing. Unlike its predecessor, the MiG-15, the MiG-17 featured a new, thinner wing swept at 45 degrees, a crucial evolutionary step designed to delay the onset of transonic compressibility. The Chinese-built J-5A variant, based on the MiG-17F, had a length of just over 11 meters, a wingspan of about 9.6 meters, and an empty weight of nearly 4,000 kilograms. The airframe employed conventional stressed skin construction with longitudinal stringers and transverse frames supporting the outer skin, a technique that Chinese engineers absorbed with varying degrees of success. Early production examples suffered from quality control issues, ranging from improper heat treatment of aluminum components to inconsistent welding of titanium parts around the engine bay, where temperatures exceeded 400 degrees Celsius during afterburner operation. The heart of the J-5 was the engine that made it a true frontline fighter, the Wopen WP-5, a direct license-built copy of the Soviet Klimov VK-1F. This centrifugal flow turbojet was already dated technology compared to Western axial flow designs, but it possessed one component that represented a massive industrial milestone for China: an afterburner. This was the first afterburning engine China had ever produced. The WP-5 provided 25.5 kilonewtons of dry thrust, but with the afterburner engaged, it punched out 33.8 kilonewtons. This extra power, while burning fuel at a prodigious rate, pushed the J-5 to a maximum speed of 1,130 kilometers per hour, approximately Mach 0.99 at 5,000 meters altitude, making it a true transonic interceptor. The aircraft's maximum speed reached approximately 1,100 kilometers per hour at sea level and could achieve transonic speeds in shallow dives, though sustained supersonic flight remained beyond its capabilities. Service ceiling hovered around 16,000 meters, respectable for a first-generation swept-wing fighter, but increasingly inadequate as air combat evolved into the supersonic realm. Its armament was a pure gun configuration, a brutal shotgun designed for attacking American bombers. It carried one 37mm Nudelman N-37 cannon in the fuselage and two 23mm Nudelman Richter NR-23 cannons under the nose. Total ammunition capacity reached 300 rounds, sufficient for approximately 2 seconds of sustained fire if all cannons discharged simultaneously, which underscores the premium placed on marksmanship and fire discipline. The J-5's avionics suite was, for China, revolutionary. It featured the ASP-4N gyroscopic gun sight, linked to an SRD-3 or SRC-3 gun-ranging radar. This system automatically fed range data to the gun sight, dramatically improving accuracy. This was China's first lesson in advanced avionics, and it came with a thick layer of irony. This Soviet innovation was not Soviet at all. Soviet engineers had, in fact, copied the entire concept from a captured American F-86 Sabre recovered during the Korean War. Thus, the very first high-tech lesson China's industry learned from its Soviet masters was that the most effective form of research and development was often reverse engineering your enemy. The cockpit arrangement reflected Soviet design priorities from the early 1950s, which is to say, it prioritized functionality over comfort with an enthusiasm bordering on hostility toward pilot ergonomics. The instrument panel presented a bewildering array of analog gauges monitoring engine parameters, flight attitudes, navigation data, and weapons status, all requiring constant cross-checking because individual instrument failures were common enough to constitute normal operating procedure. Ejection systems utilized a primitive ejection seat that functioned adequately at higher altitudes but offered dubious survival probability below 300 meters, encouraging pilots to maintain altitude whenever possible or accept that certain emergencies simply would not be survivable. On July 19, 1956, the first J-5, built entirely from Chinese-manufactured parts, not a kit, took to the skies. It was a monumental success, a propaganda victory, and proof that the 1950 treaty had worked. The apprentice had passed the test. Operational deployment of the J-5 began in earnest during 1957, with production eventually totaling approximately 767 aircraft by the time manufacturing ceased in 1959, though some sources cite figures exceeding 800 when including two-seat trainer variants. The fighter equipped numerous Air Force units and saw limited export to nations within China's sphere of influence, including North Vietnam and Albania, the latter representing one of history's more peculiar military relationships. Then, in 1958, came the trial by fire, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis. The new J-5s of the Air Force went head-to-head with the Republic of China Air Force's F-86 Sabres. On paper, the J-5, being essentially a MiG-17, was the superior aircraft, faster and with a better service ceiling. But the Chinese pilots were, in the words of one analysis, neophytes, facing Taiwanese pilots who were better trained. Then, on September 24, 1958, the J-5's technological edge vanished. The Taiwanese F-86, in a secret operation called Project Guideline, had been modified to carry a new American weapon, the GAR-8, which would soon be renamed the AIM-9B Sidewinder. In that single engagement, the world's first air-to-air missile kill was recorded as a Sidewinder fired from an F-86 tore a Chinese MiG-17 from the sky. The J-5, China's brand new fighter, a symbol of its industrial achievement, was now obsolete. Its cannon armament was a relic. The Air Force learned in blood that its brand new aircraft was already a generation behind in weaponry. This lesson, that guns were dead and the future belonged to missiles, would drive a desperate quest for the next leap forward: pure, unadulterated speed. This lesson in obsolescence led directly to the Shenyang J-6. The J-5 was fast, but it was subsonic. The future, as demonstrated by the new missiles, was about getting to the launch point first. That meant breaking the sound barrier in level flight. The Soviet answer was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-19, codenamed Farmer, the world's first mass-produced supersonic fighter. Before the Sino-Soviet relationship completely fractured, China acquired the license to produce it, designating it the Chengdu J-6, or J-6. This was not an incremental step like the J-5. It was a quantum leap in engineering complexity. The J-6 featured a sharply swept 55-degree wing, complex area ruling to manage supersonic shock waves, and most challenging of all, 2 axial-flow afterburning turbojet engines. This was exponentially more difficult than the J-5, and China's first attempt at building it, the J-6A, in 1958, was an unmitigated industrial disaster. The airframes were so riddled with manufacturing defects and quality control issues that the Air Force rejected them from service. The production jigs, themselves flawed, had to be scrapped. This failure was not just technical, it was geopolitical. This industrial collapse during 1958 to 59 coincided perfectly with the Sino-Soviet split. The Soviet specialists who had meticulously handheld Shenyang's engineers through the J-5 production were recalled. China was left utterly alone, holding a non-functional, disassembled supersonic jet that it had no idea how to build. Shenyang had to restart the entire program from scratch, painstakingly reverse engineering its own licensed product. The result, which finally entered meaningful service in the mid-1960s, was a rough-and-ready hot rod. The J-6 was powered by 2 Liming-Wopen 6A, or WP-6, turbojets, Chinese-built copies of the Tumansky RD-9. These engines gave the J-6 a phenomenal thrust-to-weight ratio, resulting in a blistering rate of climb, 35,000 feet per minute, earning it the nickname Energy God among pilots. Dimensionally, the J-6 measured 12.6 meters in length with a wingspan of 9 meters, featuring a mid-mounted swept wing with 35 degrees of sweep and pronounced anhedral to improve lateral stability at supersonic speeds. The fuselage adopted an area-ruled design, incorporating a distinctive wasp waist that reduced transonic drag. It could reach a maximum speed of 1,540 kilometers per hour, or Mach 1.45 at altitude. Maximum speed reached Mach 1.3, genuinely supersonic performance that represented a quantum leap in capability. Rate of climb approached 150 meters per second in clean configuration, allowing interception of high-altitude targets with reasonable response time. Its armament was a return to the shotgun philosophy, but even more devastating: 330mm NR-30 cannons. Later variants, like the J-6C, supplemented this with wing pylons for PL-2 or PL-5 air-to-air missiles. The irony, of course, was that the PL-2 was a reverse-engineered copy of the Soviet K-13, which itself was a reverse-engineered copy of the very AIM-9 Sidewinder that had so humbled the J-5. The loop of copying continued. The 30mm projectiles delivered substantially greater destructive effect than their 23mm predecessors, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on aircraft structures with single hits. While impressive on paper, the J-6 was a notoriously difficult beast. It was described by pilots as ill-equipped, unforgiving, and brutal. The twin WP-6 engines were temperamental, and the aircraft's systems were primitive. Starting the J-6 was not a simple checklist procedure. It was a ritual dance. The pilot and ground crew had to perfectly coordinate the finicky igniters, the fuel prime, and the spin-up from the starter motors for two separate engines. A misstep would either drain the notoriously weak batteries, leaving the 8,000-kilogram interceptor inert, or, far worse, cause a catastrophic hot start that could destroy the engine. This was not an aircraft you simply started. It was one you coaxed into life. The cockpit environment improved marginally with upgraded instruments and a more sophisticated gun sight, though pilot workload remained intense during air combat maneuvering. Environmental control systems struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures, with pilots reporting cockpits that alternated between sweltering heat during ground operations and bitter cold at altitude, neither condition conducive to peak performance during extended missions. The Soviets, who had moved on to the far superior MiG-21, viewed the MiG-19 as an awkward child, a flawed, unreliable stopgap. But China, isolated and desperate, had no other choice. It embraced the awkward child, eventually building over 4,500 of them and perfecting the design long after the Soviets had abandoned it. Production of the J-6 continued from 1960 through 1981, with various sub-variants addressing specific roles and incorporating incremental improvements. Total production exceeded 5,000 aircraft, including numerous export examples to nations ranging from Pakistan to Albania, making the J-6 among the most numerous jet fighters ever produced. The J-6's redemption came not in Chinese, but in Pakistani hands. During the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, the F-6, the export designation for the J-6, was a lethal dogfighter. Pakistani pilots flying their F-6s proved that in a close-in, visual-range turning fight, the J-6's phenomenal climb rate, agility, and heavy cannon armament could be used to devastating effect against supposedly more advanced Indian jets. The J-6 also saw extensive combat over Vietnam. The awkward child had become a seasoned and deadly brawler. For China, it was a critical lesson in asymmetric capability. A 1950s design, if properly utilized, could still dominate a 1970s battlefield. Combat employment spanned numerous conflicts, including border clashes with the Soviet Union, the Vietnam War, where Chinese pilots flew alongside North Vietnamese forces, and various Middle Eastern conflicts through export customers. The aircraft proved capable when employed within its performance envelope, achieving air-to-air victories against more sophisticated opponents through numerical advantage and aggressive tactics. While the J-6 was a lesson in brute force production, the next challenge would be an ordeal of pure reverse engineering. The J-6 was fast, but the Americans and Soviets were now flying Mach 2.0 interceptors. China needed its own. The answer was the legendary Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-21. In 1962, in a brief thawing gesture just before the final schism, Nikita Khrushchev unexpectedly offered to sell the MiG-21 F-13 technology to China. The Chinese, deeply suspicious but eager for the technology, accepted. The transfer was a sham. The Soviets delivered a handful of completed aircraft, various components, kits, and a set of incomplete design documents. Then, the advisors were withdrawn for good. To make an impossible situation catastrophic, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution began in 1966. China's engineers were now faced with the ultimate nightmare. They had to reverse engineer one of the most advanced aircraft in the world without a complete manual, while their society and industrial base were collapsing into total chaos. The first Chinese-built J-7, which flew in 1966, was a miracle of persistence, but the program was a disaster. Early production J-7s were plagued by persistent and severe quality control issues that lasted for decades, well into the 1980s. The J-7's configuration featured a distinctive delta wing with 57 degrees of leading edge sweep spanning approximately 7 meters, combined with a slender fuselage measuring roughly 14 meters in length. This delta planform provided excellent high-speed performance and structural efficiency, but imposed significant landing speed penalties and limited maneuverability at subsonic velocities, where most air combat actually occurred. Construction employed conventional aluminum alloys for primary structure with titanium components around the engine bay and leading-edge areas subject to aerodynamic heating during sustained high-speed flight. The fuselage incorporated area, ruling principles, creating the characteristic Coke bottle shape that reduced transonic drag. The single Liming Wopen 7 turbojet engine, a copy of the Soviet Tumansky R-11 series, produced approximately 4,400 kilograms of thrust dry and 6,600 with afterburner, providing thrust-to-weight ratios approaching unity in clean configuration and enabling impressive acceleration and climb performance. Maximum speed reached Mach 2.0, or approximately 2,175 kilometers per hour at 11,000 meters altitude, genuinely impressive figures that positioned the J-7 among the fastest fighters operational during the 1970s and 1980s. Service ceiling reached approximately 18,000 meters, with rate of climb exceeding 180 meters per second in optimal conditions. The intake configuration utilized a distinctive shock cone positioned at the front of the fuselage, translating fore and aft automatically to optimize airflow across varying flight regimes. A mechanically complex solution that functioned adequately when properly maintained, but represented a maintenance burden and potential failure point. Early J-7 variants retained the MiG-21's original intake design positioned at the fuselage nose, forcing radar equipment into a constricted space that severely limited antenna diameter and detection capability. An arrangement that made operational sense only if one accepted that beyond visual range combat remained science fiction. The Air Force's first indigenous upgrade demonstrated the poverty of their research and development during this period. The original MiG-21 F-13 was a pure interceptor designed for one high-speed pass. Its armament was, in the eyes of Chinese pilots trained on the J-6, ridiculous. It carried a single 30mm cannon with a paltry 60 rounds of ammunition. Once you fired, you were a missile-less, gunless dart. The J-7I, China's improved version, was a masterpiece of crude pragmatism. They simply added a second 30mm cannon in the wing root. This fix, while primitive, perfectly illustrates the J-6 mindset of the Air Force. If in doubt, add more cannons. Armament varied significantly across J-7 variants, but typically included two 30mm cannons with limited ammunition capacity, supplemented by PL-2, PL-5, or later PL-7 infrared-guided missiles carried on underwing hardpoints. Some variants deleted internal guns entirely in favor of additional missile stations or increased fuel capacity, a decision that proved short-sighted during actual combat. The cockpit reflected design priorities from the 1960s Soviet school emphasizing functional minimalism, which charitable observers might describe as Spartan and honest critics would call cramped and outdated. Visibility proved problematic with the original canopy design, forcing pilots to peer through a heavily framed structure that blocked critical sight lines, particularly during the landing approaches where the nose-high attitude characteristic of delta-wing aircraft already restricted forward vision. Avionics remained primitive by Western standards, with basic instruments and limited navigation aids, though later export variants incorporated more sophisticated equipment to meet customer requirements. The ejection seat evolved through several iterations, with later versions providing zero-zero capability, allowing safe ejection at zero altitude and zero airspeed, a critical safety enhancement. But the true story of the J-7, which remained in production for an astonishing 48 years, is not its troubled birth, but its slow, methodical evolution. The J-7's core design, the classic MiG-21 delta wing, was a brilliant high-speed solution. It allowed for a spectacular climb rate and Mach 2.0 speed. But it had a fatal flaw. In a turning dogfight, the delta wing loses more energy and bleeds speed at an alarming rate. Furthermore, its high-speed design gave it appallingly high landing speeds, making it, as one pilot noted, not an easy plane to fly. However, combat radius remained severely constrained at approximately 400 kilometers with internal fuel, reflecting the delta wing's poor lift-to-drag ratio at cruise conditions and the engine's prodigious fuel consumption. External fuel tanks extended range marginally but occupied hardpoints needed for weapons and created drag that partially negated their benefit. The J-7's doctrinal rival was the American F-5 Freedom Fighter. The F-5 was a superior, more agile turn fighter at slow speeds, while the MiG-21 was a superior energy fighter. China, stuck with the J-7, decided to fix its fundamental flaw. In the 1980s, the J-7E and later J-7G variant emerged. This aircraft featured a revolutionary compound delta wing, or double delta. This new wing design retained the original 57-degree sweep on the inboard section, but added a new 42-degree swept section on the outboard part of the wing, which also featured leading-edge flaps. This single, brilliant aerodynamic fix transformed the J-7. It sacrificed a small amount of top-end speed for vastly superior low-speed maneuverability, increased lift, and, crucially, safer landing characteristics. This was not a copy. This was the first truly original, successful Chinese aerodynamic innovation. They had taken the flawed MiG-21 and fixed it, blurring the lines between their aircraft and its F-5 rival. The J-7 saw extensive combat service throughout numerous conflicts, including border disputes, expeditionary operations through export customers, and various Middle Eastern wars where aircraft supplied to nations like Iraq encountered Western-built fighters. Combat results proved mixed, with the J-7 achieving occasional victories when employed by skilled pilots under favorable conditions, but suffering disproportionate losses against opponents with superior radar, weapons, and training. The 1982 Lebanon War provided particularly sobering data when Syrian Air Force MiG-21s, closely related to the J-7, suffered catastrophic losses against Israeli F-15 and F-16 aircraft without achieving corresponding kills, demonstrating how comprehensively modern Western fighters outclass the basic design. The J-7, powered by evolved engines like the WP-7 and WP-13, became the cheap, reliable, and surprisingly dangerous backbone of the Air Force for decades, a museum piece that could still bite. Production continued until 2006, with total numbers exceeding 2,400 airframes distributed between Chinese domestic use and export customers spanning 4 continents. The J-7's longevity owed much to economic constraints, forcing air forces to extract maximum utility from affordable platforms rather than indicating superiority over contemporary designs. Modernization efforts spawned numerous J-7 variants addressing specific deficiencies through incremental improvements. Engine upgrades improved thrust and fuel efficiency marginally, while structural reinforcements extended airframe life, allowing continued operations into the 21st century. Pakistan extensively employed the J-7 and its variants, operating the type alongside more sophisticated F-16 aircraft. By 1964, copying was no longer enough. The Air Force, facing high-altitude American threats like the B-58 Hustler bomber, the F-105 Thunder Chief, and the U-2 spy plane, needed an indigenous interceptor that could fly higher and faster than the J-7. This was the final exam. Could China's aviation industry, after 15 years of copying, finally design an aircraft on its own? The Shenyang Aircraft Corporation proposed what it called a low-risk program. This aircraft, designated the J-8, was not so much a new design as it was a crude amplification of an old one. The concept, which earned the internal nickname roast duck, was to take the J-7, essentially the MiG-21 airframe, scale it up, and power it with two of the J-7's WP-7 engines. It was, quite literally, a scaled-up twin-engine J-7. The J-8I was a catastrophe, a perfect storm of every one of China's industrial and political weaknesses. First, the concept was flawed. It was a 1950s design, a scaled-up MiG-21, being asked to solve a 1970s problem. Second, the program was crippled by the Cultural Revolution. The first prototype flew in 1969, but the design was not finalized and the aircraft did not enter service until 1980. It was 11 years late and completely obsolete on arrival. Third, and most critically, it was a technological failure. The J-8I was supposed to have a sophisticated, solid nose cone radar to be an all-weather interceptor. But China's electronics industry was simply incapable of building one. The production J-8I was forced to use the same primitive ranging radar in a shock cone design as the J-7. This made it a daytime fighter only, with no beyond visual range capability. It was, as tests later confirmed, a drag racer with poor agility and nothing more. The prototype first flew in July 1969, though development proceeded slowly amid political turmoil and technical challenges that Chinese engineers confronted without meaningful external assistance. The airframe measured 21.6 meters in length with a wingspan of 9.3 meters, substantially larger than the J-7 while retaining similar delta-wing geometry. Two Liming-Wopen 7A turbojet engines, evolved versions of the powerplant equipping the J-7, each produced approximately 6,600 kilograms of thrust with afterburner, providing combined output substantially exceeding 13,000 kilograms and enabling thrust-to-weight ratios approaching 0.9 in combat configuration. Maximum speed reached Mach 2.2, or approximately 2,340 kilometers per hour at optimal altitude, marginally faster than the J-7, though speed differences at that extreme proved tactically irrelevant since sustained flight at maximum velocity. Depleted fuel at rates rendering the capability essentially theoretical. Construction employed aluminum alloys for primary structure with selective use of titanium and steel alloys in high-stress and high-temperature areas. The wing incorporated a complex multi-spar design, providing necessary structural strength to handle increased loads from the larger airframe and higher operating weights. Shenyang was forced to start over. The resulting JA-2, codenamed Finback B, was a major development, essentially a new aircraft. The engineers, having finally learned the lesson of the J-7, ripped out the problematic MiG-21 style nose intake and completely redesigned the forward fuselage. They added two conventional side intakes which, like those on the MiG-23, freed up the entire nose. This conventional radome finally created the volume needed to house a modern, powerful, fire-control radar. The revised intake configuration improved cockpit visibility and simplified maintenance access while providing adequate airflow across the flight envelope, though the ventral location introduced vulnerability to foreign object damage during operations from poorly maintained airfields. There was just one problem. China still could not build the radar. In the 1980s, with relations warming with the West, China sought help. This led to the 1986 Peace Pearl program, a $502 million deal with the American contractor Grumman to upgrade 50 to 55 J-8Bs with a full suite of F-16 level avionics. This included the Westinghouse AN/APG-66 radar, head-up displays, new cockpit displays, and a modern MIL-STD-1553B data bus. 2 J-82 airframes were physically flown to the United States for modification. This was China's attempt to buy its way out of its 30-year technological gap. Structurally, the J-82 retained the basic J-8 configuration while incorporating refined aerodynamics, including revised wing leading edges, modified fuselage contours, reducing drag, and improved control surfaces, enhancing maneuverability. Attention to reducing radar cross-section through careful shaping and incorporation of radar-absorbent materials in certain areas demonstrated awareness of stealth principles. Then, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square crisis occurred. The West imposed sanctions, and the Peace Pearl program was summarily killed. This was the final, devastating, and most important lesson the Chinese aviation industry ever learned. Reliance on the Soviet Union had failed in 1960. Reliance on their own indigenous capability, the J-8I, had failed in the 1970s. And now, reliance on the West had failed in 1989. They could not trust anyone. The J-8 was troubled, and its paper specifications were often exaggerated. But its failure was the most important success in Air Force history. It was the failure that forced China, out of sheer desperation, to finally develop its own advanced electronics. The J-8F, a later variant, was the first Chinese aircraft equipped with a domestically developed pulse Doppler radar, the Type 1492, and its own beyond visual range missiles, like the PL-11 and PL-12. The J-8 was the painful, humiliating, and necessary crucible that forged China's modern aerospace independence. Avionics modernization represented the most significant J-80 enhancement, with later variants incorporating digital flight control systems, multifunction displays, improved navigation systems integrating satellite positioning, and compatibility with helmet-mounted sights, enabling high off-boresight missile engagement. Production of various J-82 variants continued through the 1990s and early 2000s, with approximately 300 aircraft completed, providing meaningful capability enhancement for the Chinese Air Force during a period when acquisition of more modern foreign designs proved either diplomatically impossible or financially impractical. Combat capability remained constrained by fundamental design limitations, including mediocre transonic acceleration, high landing speeds requiring long runways, disappointing turn performance at medium altitudes where most engagements occurred, and continued avionics shortcomings despite successive upgrades. This 50-year apprenticeship, this brutal and expensive education, defined the Air Force's first and second generations of aircraft. The J-5 was China learning to copy. The J-6 was China learning to produce at scale and to perfect a flawed design the original creator had discarded. The J-7 was China learning for the first time to innovate and fix a core aerodynamic flaw. And the J-8, in its spectacular series of failures, was China learning the most important lesson of all: to design for itself, because relying on any other nation, be it Russia or America, was a strategic dead end. This legacy of failure is the foundation of China's success. The modern fourth-generation J-10 and the fifth-generation J-20 were not a sudden leap. They are the direct descendants of this half-century struggle, built upon the industrial base, the technical knowledge, and the hard-won political lessons provided by the J-5, the J-6, the J-7, and the roast duck that finally taught China to fly on its own. Each program faced distinct challenges and achieved varying degrees of success, measured against intended objectives and operational requirements. Collectively, they established foundations enabling China's subsequent emergence as a credible aerospace power capable of producing fighters approaching Western standards. A transformation requiring 6 decades of sustained investment, occasional setbacks, and determination to overcome technological and industrial limitations that would have discouraged less committed nations. The journey from the J-5's first flight in 1956 to the J-20's unveiling in the 21st century is not just a technical evolution. It is a story of national determination, of learning from humiliation, and of refusing to remain dependent. It is the story of how failure, when embraced and learned from, becomes the foundation for future success.